taking time out of your Saturday to join us today. It's our very first Surf City Author Fest, and I'm so excited to see you all here. How's the festival going for you? Good? All right, thank you. So this is our children's book panel. It's going to be about world building, fairy tale retellings, but just writing in general. My name is Hoang. I'm the adult librarian, which sounds weird because I am an adult and I'm a librarian, but really it means I'm a librarian who oversees public services and adult services. I'm also an author, but I'm really excited today to moderate our panel of authors, and I will let them introduce themselves in a few minutes. And I also wanted to announce that after our panel, if you wanted to purchase books and have them signed by the authors, they will be returning to the book fair upstairs in our traffic circle. So please meet them out there afterwards if you want to chat with them or discuss their books some more. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce, or let our authors introduce themselves, and we will start with Neil.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me okay out there? All right, my name is Neil V. Young, and I'm a science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer. I just finished my debut novel, which I'm hawking upstairs, so I could always use a little bit more out there. That's about it.
I'm also Neil Young. That was a joke between us that I was going to copy his notes because
he didn't have time.
He's prepared.
Yeah.
The rest of us, maybe not so much. I am Josiah Golojuh. I am a writer. I wrote a young adult paranormal fiction novel, The Paperboy, and you can find it up there with the novel and related comic books from the world of that novel, and a book of poetry that's a gift to my wife, who hopefully will be walking through the doors in a minute.
My name is Joshua Hauke, and I write and illustrate children's and middle grade graphic novels and comics. I absolutely love it, and I tend to work within, I would say, magic realism or fantasy.
My name is Brandi June. I'm a YA fantasy author. My debut Goldspun is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling where the Miller stars a con artist, Rumpelstiltskin's a mysterious fae, hijinks ensue. And my latest novel, Magic at the Grand Dragonfly Theater, is about two sisters in a Victorian-era theater. One has secret illegal magic she has to hide, and the other has no magic, but performs on stage and does all the sleight of hand. And then a young bounty hunter infiltrates the theater.
And I'm Van. I write books for middle grade and adults. I had a recent novel come out. It's called Auntie Q's Golden Claws Nail Salon, and it's based on a very traumatic summer I had working at a nail salon. Okay, and we will launch into our questions, and at the end we will have a chance for audience questions as well, so please get your brains working. Okay, our very first question for our panelists is, where do you get your ideas for your stories, and how do you start to develop them into a book? So anyone can jump in.
Everybody's looking at me.
You brought the notes.
Yeah, I came prepared. So, pretty much anywhere. My brain, unfortunately, works overtime, whether I'm trying to sleep or not. And I can get the idea from anything. It could be a person, it could be a place, it could be a feeling, you name it. For example, under my book, Under Crimson Skies, that came about because I was looking at a wrought iron rusted sewage grate in Dublin, Ireland. Okay, and I just kind of took it from there. I thought, well, who moves down the sewers? Well, criminals do. Okay, where do they always end up? And it's not very environmentally correct, but back in the Middle Ages, they always emptied out into the harbor, so that's where he would be going. Suddenly I had a pirate adventure. It just kind of gets nebulous from there. So, I mean, it can strike anytime, any place, anywhere.
So I'm going to copy his. No, I'm not going to keep doing that. Maybe I will one more time, but there's a certain point where I think with comedy, right, it gets funny, and then it stops being funny, and then it gets funny again. So we'll see if I can get to that point with that joke. But with the world building for me, like, at least with specifically the paper book, which I'm here with today, I was a paper boy in the 90s, so the novel was set there. I always had this desire to tell the story of the people that populated that world, and I couldn't crack how to do it, and I couldn't figure it out. And then I had a writer at USC in grad school, and her name was Coleman Huff, and she really challenged me in ways that I wasn't expecting, to push me in different directions, and then it pushed it into this paranormal side. So there's that element, but for me, what it is, I think that the answer to this real question is, grounded in something tangible and real that I can connect with. It doesn't have to be so specific to my actual experience as it is in this case, but it kind of speaks to what Neil said, that it's something that you can latch onto, that it's real and you can connect with, and that makes it feel authentic, makes it feel like from our world, even if it is a world of a paper boy with a ghost or post-apocalyptic kid zombie things. I think teasing his side, but you know, these different things. There's some element of it that, like, for me, it's like even when I read, it's like, oh, that thing that latches on. So I try to bring that to my writing, reality things and personal experiences. Maybe it's people you've met. All those things are the real things that might be the nugget of the thing, and then it becomes its own thing often, as it did with my novel. But it starts with that real grounded thing.
For me, I was a really terrible reader when I was younger, but like really bad, and I actually got held back in the second grade because I was such a bad reader. And I found that I just had such an active imagination when I was a kid. It was hard for me to read books because my brain would go places that the books never went. So when I am writing a story for kids or for adults even, I always try to write for that kid that I was when I was younger. So when I'm coming up with ideas, I try to be playful with the ideas. I have little ones, and I'm often playing imaginative games with them. The villain for my latest series, Doomsday Camp, actually came out of playing with my daughter, who was, I think, 4 or 5 at the time. But I really try to cater stories to the kid that I was when I was a kid, and hopefully I'll connect with some of those kids that weren't very good readers or aren't very good readers. And maybe my book will be the thing that convinces them to read more.
In my case, a lot of what I do is play with the kernel of an idea of what if. With Dragonfly Theater, I have this image of this young woman on stage with a spotlight on her in this beautiful black silver star gown, doing just these amazing feats of magic or illusion. And the question was, is what she's doing real magic or is it illusion? And sort of playing with that idea. In terms of the fairy tale retelling with Rumpelstiltskin, I always thought the miller's daughter didn't have much agency in the original. Her dad says she can spin the gold, the king makes her. So it's like, well, how could we give her more agency? And for me, that's like, well, if she's gonna get in trouble, what if she's the one who gets herself in trouble? And that led to the idea of what if she was a con artist? And it's very much, here's some straw, magic straw. Oh, look over there. Oh, now it's gold. Would you like to buy some of my magical straw? You can make yours into gold too. So a lot of times I just like to sort of daydream and kind of brainstorm what if ideas.
I have a follow-up question, which I'm sorry, Neil, if I didn't prepare you for this in our list.
Okay, ambush, here we go.
So my problem often is I have so many ideas and I don't know which one can be viable enough, I guess, to turn into a book. So how do you guys distinguish between what ideas are just ideas and what could be turned into a novel or
My advice to you is write it down. Write everything down, because I guarantee you 5 seconds later, you'll have completely forgotten about it. Okay,
Because I'll
what
remember
happens.
and I never do.
No, I'm not going on notes on this one. I know. That's right, writing it down.
I mean, I do agree, because I have like a running list of book ideas, and sometimes it's just, you know, a sentence, and then you start kind of picking up pieces of the story as you go along, and eventually you have enough and you go, oh, this is a story, or maybe this is part of a different story and it fits in a different spot somewhere else.
Yeah, I actually have a box, a literal idea box, where I'll write it down and I'll put it in that box, especially if I'm, stuck on what to do. As far as which ones I decide to make into actual full-on stories or even novels, I think short stories are a great place to play with that, because you can examine the idea, you can play in that world a little bit without the commitment of writing 200 pages. Instead, you're playing with 10 and 20. Is that, do I see this going further? Goldspun actually started as a short story, and I was like, oh, but there's a lot more here I want to develop. And so I always like the idea of playing with short stories. I also see which ones really excite me. Which ones am I like, okay, I need to write it down, put it in the box, and maybe I'll get back to it. And which ones are ones that just won't get out of my head. I'm like, oh, this could be fun. I'm actually drafting my first adult fantasy novel about a fake psychic, with the idea of like, what if a fake psychic got involved with like all the trickster gods of mythology? And like, what would this person do? Because they don't have any actual powers, they just fake it. And it was really fun to me, and I'm like, oh, this could be really fun. And just, I got really excited to write it and really wanted to dive into that world head first.
So you think, oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, you already talked, I was kidding. You probably have something better to say than I do. But there's, the expression in writing, like killing your darlings, right? There's gonna be good ideas that just don't have the legs to be maybe a novel or this or that. So it is exploring and finding out what has the strength and what kind of story. So again, when I was in grad school at USC, I had a teacher, his name was S.L. Stiebel, and he had a technique that he learned from going out to Ray Bradbury. And Ray's technique was like, I don't know if he called it this is what Sid called it, finding your secret story. And it was about, essentially, you wake up in the morning, and kind of speaking to what you said, Neil, you write down everything you have in your head. You just purge these thoughts, whatever it might be, and you kind of do that, and you file that away. And this is something that Ray Bradbury did, and my teacher did. And you'd have this, log of all these things written, and then you let it sit as you should with certain writing. You separate yourself from it. You have a draft, maybe give it however much time you need to like get new eyes on it. You go back to those things, and you start to pull out elements of that story. And I've kind of applied my own version of this differently than them, but whenever I do that, I kind of find, okay, when I have the concept of a story that I want to then expand into a novel or something longer, then I'll go to those other random, brain dumpage type of notes and see what else is here that I can pull from or that fits in with this thing to give it those legs to sustain it. So I can like build off of that thing from these other techniques, sort of like, okay, what is sort of subconsciously in my head that does connect that I'm not seeing the connections?
Which is a good point. I think murder your darlings is the old saying on something like this, but a little bit what Brandi was talking about, a box. Just because you murder them for this novel doesn't mean they're not going to be resurrected for the next novel. And if it's a good idea, sooner or later you're going to find a use for it.
Yeah, to back up what all you guys are saying is I think the most important thing is to be excited about whatever the idea is. And if you're really excited about it, that's how you know it has legs. Because you're going to be looking at whatever you're working on for the next year or two, and you do not want to get a year in and go, I don't know that I like this anymore. So you got to make sure that you are excited. I mean, that's really how you're going to know that it's what you want to work on.
Have any of you ever worked on a story for a year and then discovered that you don't want to anymore?
Yes.
Not so much I didn't want to. I have worked on a story for over a year and then had it sort of die on submission. And so it's one thing that I'm like, maybe someday I'll bring it back, but maybe not. So yeah.
I can tell you on the art side of things, yes. I have a book that's going to come out from Putnam in like early 2027. It's called Icarus Chan and the Space Rescue Plan, and it's all about this boy who built a rocket out of an old water tower on the roof of his building. But I had this idea where, everything's going to be built out of like found junk that he could find and actually build something out of. And then I spent like all this time like looking up websites that sell garage sale things, and then it came time to put all these pieces together, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be drawing this forever because it's just so many little elements, but I knew that that's what I wanted. So I definitely regretted in hindsight, I guess, what I was considering a future Josh problem when I was writing it.
All right, on to our second question. What is your process for world building? And do you have any tricks up your sleeve, tried and true steps you always take, or any tips for our beginner writers?
Sure. So what I tend to do is I spend a lot of time kind of playing in the sandbox, like daydreaming and just imagining what the world looks like long before I even start outlining. And one thing I will start doing is I'll just do a lot of research into places that might be similar, especially if it's a fantasy world like Dragonfly Theater. Technically it's a fantasy world, but it feels very much like Britain in 1890. So just did a ton of research there, made a bunch of notes, and then when it comes to actually writing, then I kind of pick and choose which elements I want to be accurate, which ones I want to be fantastical and made up. For beginner writers too, I would also recommend a place to kind of keep your research that makes sense to you. I did my first couple novels, I did my research in Excel, and then I moved into Scrivener, which is a writing program. I don't draft in Scrivener, but I did find it really helpful for me in terms of like keeping track of the characters, of the settings, of, you know, fun facts of the world. What's the currency? What foods are there? What do they eat? And that's where I start. And then in terms of world building as well, also especially when it comes to fairy tale retellings, I research the fairy tale, I know the story inside and out, but then also give myself the freedom to take and get rid of whatever works best for my story, knowing that it is a retelling and it is my retelling. So I don't need all of the elements that were necessarily in the original. In fact, I don't, because otherwise it'd be the original. We already have that. So giving myself the freedom to really kind of twist and meld the story was a very liberating freedom.
For me, I have found the best way to world build is with rules. It doesn't really matter what the rules are. They could be no rules at all. But as soon as you establish that this is how this world works, it makes it a lot easier to set your story within it. My series Doomsday Camp, which takes place after the world has ended and all the remaining humans have mutated and become weird, my rule for that world was anything could happen. So once I would come up with a joke, there's a joke throughout the book where they talk about how nobody eats vegetables anymore because of the vegetable uprising. Well, that became part of that world's history. So sometimes if your rule is no rules, then you know I've got to stay within this framework.
For the second part of it, I think for the advice is what I inadvertently did. Write what you know to start. I started with, okay, I want to tell the story of the people in the paper route. There was an example where one of my early readers was a girl that I went to high school with, know her particularly well, but the book is set, I'm from Western Pennsylvania. I live here at Huntington Beach now, but I'm from Western Pennsylvania originally, where the novel is set. And she's reading it and she's like messaging me, right? She's like, did this person live here? And she's like going through all these things of describing a specific place, more than the details that are in the book, right? And she's like, that was my grandfather. And I didn't even realize that the character, I knew it was loosely based on one of the customers that I had when I delivered the paper, but that she was like moved how realistically or whatever I captured him. He's in the book, he's called Old Man Mumbles, because you couldn't understand a word he said for real. And she said that was the way he was, we never understood what he was saying. And so it was really like this cool, sweet moment that I did not expect. I just remember the old guy that I couldn't quite understand what he said, and the other details came from that. So I think it kind of speaks to that first answer of like, the real tangible details of things that, you know, for me, I guess I pull from reality more than I think. Even when I'm writing something like I have an unpublished sci-fi novel that's definitely outside there, there's, you know, elements of our world that I pull in. But writing what you know is where I started. Even like my daughter here is in the front row, she wrote for, the school had the Reflections art contest, which can be music, dance, theater, and Penny wrote a story about an act of, the theme was I Belong. And so she wrote a short story and she placed third or second, what did you get, Penny? But she did very good. But the point was that she wrote a story about helping a friend on the playground, right? Because that's her world that she knows. And that's her, as a third grader, her entry into how do I tell a story? I start with the place I know, the people I know, and build from there. And then just, it'll take you on a journey to where it ends up going. And I think that ties into world building, because then you have these tangible world things. And I do like what Josh said a lot by understanding what are the rules of the story I'm telling, you know. If I have this sci-fi thing, okay, what are the limitations? What are the rules? If you're doing something like, you know, the fantasy stuff, the sci-fi, like you have to understand what are those parameters you're working with. And you can, you know, you're the writer, you can then understand and bend and break them, but you have to like start with some framework. You know, it's like a Christopher Nolan movie, right? Like, you like understanding, part of the fun of those movies is like, okay, what are the parameters that he is setting with this narrative, and like, okay, the time structure, the story structure, so understanding that in your work. So.
Okay, with me, it generally starts with the protagonist and their viewpoint. It's what they commonly use, it's what they consider common in their lives, which is absolutely going to take you out of your world and say, this is the world that you're in right now. Okay, for example, I had a novel that I was working on for a while that had a number of teleports. That was one of the big magic things that it was. And I started off with the guy who was walking through this rather heated tropical area, and he's dressed in furs and sweating and everything. And he comes all the way over, so he's talking to his friend, and then all of a sudden he just crosses over, and literally he's in this ice cold place with a wind outside and all that. So that brought that world into being a little bit. As far as advice goes, I think one of the biggest pitfalls I've found, at least in a lot of my critique groups, would generally be the fact that people seem to feel they have to explain everything and how it works. My general rule is if the protagonist doesn't know how it works, you don't know how it works. I mean, you can sit there and explain how a car works, but basically it's either running or it's not type thing. And again, it's what you know, it's what the protagonist knows. And if they don't know that, then you can have other things that you can walk by a large machine that makes a lot of humming noises and everything else, and no one really knows what it is until he sees a sign that says it. You can't sit there and say, oh, well, it works with this because this comes into here and then this goes out there. It doesn't work that way. So you don't over-explain it.
Just jumping on that, that reminds me when I was working on the sci-fi novel, which is not published, but I had a similar circumstance where I had most of the thing written, and my teacher at the time was like, I want you to write this prologue that explains the world. I spent weeks, and he was like giving me such a hard time. It was just the struggle to write. It was one of those points where I hated what I was writing. And then finally, at the end of it, like a month or two in, I read it, and he's like, okay, good, now you can throw it out. And that was that kind of thing where it's like, okay, now that you know what this world is, the history of this world, all these things, your reader doesn't need that because hopefully will just be building that in. But I had to get that in and get that out, and he's like, yeah, now you can trash that prologue. That was, which was devastating in that moment, but then I walked home.
Lesson learned, I guess.
Did the Charlie Brown walk with my head down and thought about it, and then just said, oh, okay, I understand what he's trying to show me here and teach me through.
Sometimes it's for us and not for them, though. I mean, I think that's a big thing to think about. For a reader, sometimes the best world building is no world building. It's got to be you're immersing yourself in that world. You don't want to see all the strings and stuff holding everything up. We need to know, but you guys don't need to know because we want you in the story.
Did you already get to answer?
I did.
Okay, what are some of your favorite childhood stories or fairy tales that have inspired you?
Rumpelstiltskin. I obviously was fascinated by Rumpelstiltskin and wrote a retelling based around it. I will say I always loved the dark original, sort of the grim versions of the fairy tales of, Hans Christian Andersen, Grimm Brothers, and the evil stepmothers dancing in red hot shoes, and I love sort of this. There's an element of fanciful whimsy, but then there's also sort of these dark undertones. A lot of times, because these stories were meant as warnings to the kids: don't stray off the path, or the wolf will eat you. So I really loved those tales. I loved a lot of mythology as well from a very early age. Kind of always wanted there to be just something a little more out there.
Did you used to watch Once Upon a Time?
I did, yes.
Did you hate the Rumpelstiltskin Once Upon a Time?
No, I love a morally gray character. So I love a villain with a soft side. I love a hero with an evil streak. I think to me, having the morally gray characters is what makes them interesting. As much as I love the fairy tales, most of the characters in them are very black and white because they're meant to be, just the type of person because you're teaching a lesson, you're not creating fully fleshed humans. So what I love about fairy tale retellings is you have those sort of bones and sort of that feel of the fairy tale, but it's a new experience with characters that are more relatable. They're more, you can empathize with, you get more invested in them. So that is why I always love a good retelling. I love a good morally gray character.
I would say I was always kind of drawn a little bit more to maybe like folklore type stuff, like Babe in the Blue Ox. Like, love the idea that he like made the Grand Canyon by like dragging his axe. That kind of magical realism, I guess, has had a big impact on my own work, because I like the idea of seeing something in two different ways. Like, even though we know that's what the story is, we know that's not really how the Grand Canyon was created. And so the
It's
fact
not?
that would be great if it was. But yeah, I mean, I love the idea of figuring out the creative way, or like the way that like a kid or somebody with a really big imagination would think about how this thing works versus how it actually happened. And I think that I try to carry that through my own work, particularly in the first series that I did, which is called Tales of the Brothers 3. It was all about taking stories from my own family and then putting that same kind of imaginative spin in it, where I explained how things had happened in our house, but the way I would have imagined it as a kid. So when you're writing, you have to say like, well, this is what's really happening versus this is what they're imagining is happening. And that has always been a really fun idea to me.
It's just like the kind of question, my kids are in the front row, and it'd be like if you ask me, which is your favorite? Like my daughters, and I love them equally. So I think of all these things that are rushing through my head right now that have influenced me. But if there's like sort of a point of origin for me, it's first filmically is The Empire Strikes Back specifically, and Star Wars in general, but because I say that because we had recorded off the television, you know, when you had to record VHS off TV before we were too cheap to buy it, I guess. I didn't have the, you know, first Star Wars, fourth Star Wars now, A New Hope, but we had Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and I would watch those. I would start with Empire, so like that was very influential. Like, we didn't have a lot of things to watch. We had a handful of, you know, videotapes, and that was one of them that I would just watch over and over and over again. And then I read a lot of comic books as a kid, which you'll understand, you know, there's some comic books up there, and those were hugely influential. X Factor in the 90s by Peter David, that was where he, you know, you're taking superheroes and psychologically examining them. There's one specific issue, X Factor 87, where it's literally they go to a therapist. And as a kid reading that, it was really powerful because like you're seeing these superhero comic book characters that are really broken, right? And that's now we know that, but at least to me at the time, that I couldn't understand, I couldn't comprehend it, and help me understand, relate to them as people, not just, you know, people who can shoot beams from their hands. And then specifically, I had a teacher in the 5th grade who encouraged me to read comics. My parents asked because they were like, should we be worried he's reading a lot of comic books? And she's like, no, he's reading, that's good. I don't have enough of my students read. And then I remember, I read other things, but the one that stands out at that time was I read The Hobbit for the first time. And that was just like, you know, a completely different thing. This adventure in another world that I hadn't yet experienced in literature at that point. You know, this is in the 90s before we had tons of, you know, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. And so that was sort of some of the foundational building blocks. There's a lot of other ones that are, you know, coming in out of my head, but those are kind of like when I really, really narrow it down and pinpoint, those are some of the key ones.
With me, it started with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In 2nd grade, I had a teacher who read all the Chronicles for us. We couldn't wait to hear it. We actually looked forward to that every day. And I remember I was so sold on it, I made my mother take me up to B. Dalton and buy me the whole box set. B. Dalton, I'm obviously dating myself here. But,
that's most of the rest of us talking about what we did in the 90s.
Yeah, well, this was way before then, so I'm old, okay? Then a few years later, my friend introduced me to Fritz Lieber and his Fafa and the Grey Mauser adventures. And then a little bit later, it was a deadlock because my friends got me into Dungeons and Dragons. And from that point, it was a lock after that.
Hugely influential. X Factor in the 90s by Peter David, that was where he, you know, you're taking superheroes and psychologically examining them. There's one specific issue, X Factor 87, where literally they go to a therapist. And as a kid reading that, it was really powerful because like you're seeing these superhero comic book characters that are really broken, right? And that's now we know that, but at least to me at the time, that I couldn't understand it, I couldn't comprehend it, and help me understand, relate to them as people, not just, you know, people who shoot beams from their hands. And then specifically, I had a teacher in the 5th grade who encouraged me to read comics. My parents asked because they were like, should we be worried if he's reading a lot of comic books? And she's like, no, he's reading. That's good. I don't have enough of my students reading. And then I remember I've read other things, but the one that stands out at that time was I read the Hauke for the first time. And that was just like, a completely different thing. This adventure in another world that I hadn't yet experienced in literature at that point. This is in the 90s before we had tons of, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. And so that was sort of some of the foundational building blocks. There's a lot of other ones that are, coming in out of my head, but those are kind of like when I really, really narrow it down and pinpoint those are some of the key ones.
With me, it started with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In second grade, I had a teacher who read all the Chronicles for us. We couldn't wait to hear it. We actually looked forward to that every day. And I remember I was so sold on it, I made my mother take me up to B. Dalton and buy me the whole box set. B. Dalton, I'm obviously dating myself here. But
as opposed to the rest of us talking about what we did in the 90s.
Yeah, well, this was way before then, so I'm old. Okay. Anyway, then a few years later, my friend introduced me to Fritz Lieber and his Pfaffen and the Grey Mauser adventures. And then a little bit later, it was a deadlock because my friends got me into Dungeons and Dragons. And from that point, it was a walk after that. Because not only was D&D something that you could do, it also, TSR at the time was producing a wide number of books. I got hooked on the Dark Elf trilogy and really of a number of different things. So for me, it was a kind of a slowly thing that it just sucked me in completely. So.
Okay, when you're drafting your stories, what comes first for you? Character, setting, place, or other story elements?
Yes. So I think it's always different depending on the story. Like, speaking to the paper boy that I have here today, that started with the desire to, sort of tell the story of the people and the experience. But I had a scene where this was based on a real moment where when one day I went to deliver the newspapers, there's helicopters flying, there's a SWAT team with automatic rifles, all this stuff. And this again is in the 90s when in rural Pennsylvania where I grew up. So this was like really, really crazy and shocking. And the thing that I started with when I heard the very, very first version of that was that scene. That was the entry point into that. It doesn't always start that way, but for that one, that was the thing where I had this visual moment. And in the story, it went from, it moved around, things change and shift as you develop these things, but it started with that moment for me, in that instance of that specific thing.
Yeah, it's definitely all of the above. Anything can set me off. It becomes nebulous, which is the word.
Other story elements.
Yes. So I think it's always different depending on the story. Speaking to the paper boy that I have here today, that started with the desire to, sort of tell the story of the people and the experience. But I had a scene where this was based on a real moment where when one day I went to deliver the newspapers, there's helicopters flying, there's a SWAT team with automatic rifles, all this stuff. And this again is in the 90s when in rural Pennsylvania where I grew up. So this was really, really crazy and shocking. And the thing that I started with when I heard the very, very first version of that was that scene. That was the entry point into that. It doesn't always start that way, but for that one, that was the thing where I had this visual moment. And in the story, it went from, it moved around, things change and shift as you develop these things, but it started with that moment for me, in that instance of that specific thing.
Yeah, it's definitely all of the above. Anything can set me off. It becomes nebulous, which is the word I use very often. It just keeps going more and more, and I get heavier and heavier into it. That's why I always write it down, because there's no way I'm remembering all of that stuff. It's like I described it before, just looking at something as common as a sewer grate and ending up with a pirate adventure. Other times, I come upon people, I met some guys who are just so arrogant, they bug the living crap out of me. And I'm like, they would make a really good villain. So I work with that. It can happen anywhere at any time. This book, which I have right here, which is my breakthrough novel, was actually started based on when I was at a underground street race, and it developed from there. So, the answer to answer your question, yes, all of the above.
It's nice of you to turn your real life enemies into villains, because mine usually become victims.
Remind me to stay on your good side.
For me, once I have that what if, I say character usually comes first for me. I have an acting background. I was an actor long before I was a writer, so Magic at the Grand Dragonfly Theater is in part my love letter to theater. Because for me, character always comes first. I like to embody the characters. I live in their heads a long time. I think about what they would do in different situations and kind of just sort of like play around with that for a long time, trying to figure out who they are and what they do. I am a plotter, so at some point I start to outline because I'm like, great, I have this character, I have this cool what if. Now what? So I kind of fit loosely the puzzle pieces together of a plot before I then start writing it. But it definitely starts to me with like character in the world.
For me, I feel like it could really be any number of these things like you guys are all saying. Sometimes you get a character, sometimes you'll get even a title that sticks out in your head and you think, oh, that's a cool title. What kind of story would that be?
And then the editor changes it.
Always. No kidding, yes. I remember my book, which is called Doomsday Camp, at one point we had thought about calling it Doomsday Care because they were saying like, oh, well, maybe the kids would be younger, So it does happen, but a lot of times I really feel like you just get a piece of a story or maybe a glimpse of a character, and that's what will really kind of make you, like we talked about earlier, get excited about it, and then you start filling out everything around it.
I will also say something, especially for any aspiring writers, is for me what really helped get through that first draft was giving myself permission to write a terrible first draft. I initially would get stuck on like writing and rewriting the first chapter, the first couple chapters over and over in editing, and I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to look as good as, read as good as the books that I was reading, not, quite being like, yeah, but the books I'm reading have already gone through a ton of edits. And what I found is that I actually had to write a whole really awful draft first, which isn't always as awful as I think it is when I'm writing it, but giving myself permission to write something that's very imperfect so that then I actually have something I can go back and edit. Because as I've heard before, you can edit a terrible first draft, you can't edit a blank page. And kind of giving myself that freedom to be like, I don't care if this is good or bad, I'm just getting it out there. I think was really a big turning point for me as an author.
I love that you brought that up. Does anyone else have any tips on how to get through a very grueling first draft?
I always tend to overwrite myself. I would rather really just get it flowing and get it out, and then you step back and look at it. And actually one of the things I'll often do is I'll take one of my stories and I'll look at something else I like, possibly even like a TV show or a cartoon sometimes, because they're so digestible. Like a lot of cartoons now are only about 10 minutes long. And I think if this book was an episode of this show, how would they take my story and lay it out? And sometimes it is like a creative problem-solving situation where you can go, oh, well, they would have done this and this, and so I don't need this part, and that can be really freeing sometimes.
Yeah, I think the definite thing to do is turn off your inner critic, turn off your inner editor, and just write. And that can be very hard to do some days. You sit there and you're like always, oh no, I don't like that. And you go back and you rewrite it real fast. Next thing you know, you've been there for over an hour. You get like half a page. That's not what you want. You just want to go. Brandi said it best. If it's not something that doesn't look very good, you'll get that when you're editing it, when the editor and the critiquer comes back online. But you kind of have to compartmentalize when you're doing that.
I think it's Stephen King in his sort of writing book / memoir on writing, it's called. He had a thing where he was working as a high school kid in a local newspaper, and he went to the editor, and the editor was edited it down. He handed it back. It was the second draft is first draft minus 10%, and that kind of thing where it's kind of overwrite. This is where you write those things that I don't need to explain how the wheels on this science fiction race car works, whatever it might be. You just you maybe write your way through that, and then you kind of pare it down. I write it down a lot with everything I've written. I talk too much in life, I write too much on paper, so like, okay, like how do I pare it down? Same thing, so just kind of like taking it, overwrite, as Josh said, and then, keeping the stuff that works, and there's gonna be stuff that's bad, and I remember when I was in grad school, one of the things I wrote, like, prior to that, like when I was in high school, some really, really, really bad screenplays, and I was really, like, sharing some of my writing, like, well, I've never really finished anything. My teacher kind of pressed me on, like, well, you've finished something, you've written that, right? I'm like, yeah, but they're bad. He's like, yeah, but you finished it. So, like, I've had, quote, more accomplished writers that can't say that with certain projects, that they don't get done. Like, if you get through something, good, bad, or whatever, you've accomplished a thing. That's a thing you did. So be proud of that, and then hopefully you can then make it better, but be proud you got through that draft. And sometimes that can be really difficult. So.
I would also just add, well, I also tend to overwrite, which is great. It's much easier to cut than add. On the flip side, something else I do when I'm drafting, if I'm really stuck somewhere, I'm like, I really just don't know how to move on. I also give myself permission to just like give myself a note. I draft in Word, usually I'll do in the comment, I'll be like, figure this out later. So sometimes it's like, write this epic battle next time, or, figure out how they make up after their fight, because that way I can keep going instead of like getting stuck and then I get frustrated and then I'm frustrated that I'm stuck. For me, I'm like, okay, I'll get back to it later. I just want to keep going. And a lot of times, by the time I get back to it, I'll have figured out some ideas for it because, it sort of simmers in the back of your head, sloshes around while you're doing other things. So that's sort of almost like an underwriting trick that I have when I get really stuck, to just kind of keep going. So I'd say that, and I'd also say don't, be okay, or don't beat yourself up if you feel like you're not getting enough writing done, or you're not writing every day, or you're not writing enough. I know a lot of us, even, myself, I have a day job as well. So it's hard to always write, but knowing that if you keep writing and keep at it, eventually all of the words add up to a book. So even if it's, 10 minutes here or there, eventually it keeps going and will become a book. And that's, you're not, especially if you're not on a deadline. I write in a very different style if I'm on deadline, but if I'm not on deadline, it's, if I keep writing this story, eventually it will be a whole story.
Hardest thing sometimes is just getting started. So if you start anything, that's great.
I like to use this app. It's called the Most Dangerous Writing Game. Have you guys ever heard of it? Well, okay.
No, what is it?
Okay. So it's technically, you can just use it like as a web browser, but it's a game where you can set whatever goal you want. So either by minutes or by words. So I usually set it to like 500 words. And as soon as you set it and you start writing, if you do not continue writing, the words disappear. And you cannot copy and paste it. You cannot stop until you reach your goal.
That's going to be a form of torture.
It is definitely a form of torture. I am sweating buckets the entire time I'm writing, but by the end,
you just start typing words just so you don't.
It's rare, but sometimes I do get stuck, and I'm just pressing the space bar and biding my time until the next word comes.
See, here I was like thinking like, oh yeah, if you don't write till that time, they don't give you the antidote. But no, that's actually scarier for me.
Yeah. When I tell people this, they're very like, wow, you're hardcore. But it works when you are stuck and you just need to get the words flowing. It does work. So, okay. Next question. These are kind of two. So I'm just going to combine them. But what is your biggest challenge or your favorite thing about writing fantasy or science fiction or magical books?
My biggest challenge a lot of times is finding the time. As I did mention, I do also have a day job. So like right now I'm in the middle of a R&R, which is a revise and resubmit, where an editor's like, we like this book, but we'd like to see these changes, make these changes, and we'll think about buying it. So I'm really jazzed about the edits I'm working on, but by the time I get home and have had dinner and maybe said hello to my spouse, it's like, okay, now it's like 9 o'clock at night, and try to crank out a couple hours and then do it all again. So, finding that balance has been really challenging because I'm like, but I want to do more, but also I'm tired, and kind of accepting that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and trying to avoid burnout that way. So I'd say that's the really hard thing. What I love most of all is sharing my stories. That's why I love coming to events like this. It's why I write the stories to get them out there. Even when I was an actor as well, it was like the thrill of sharing stories with other people and sharing, in my books, I have these magical worlds and these new experiences and characters, and being able to share it with people and be like, hey, join me, come with me, I want to share this cool journey with you. And for me, that is the most exciting part of writing fantasy.
I completely agree. Like events like this, people don't understand, like when you're writing, you're by yourself all the time, and you're really not sure if what you're doing is connecting with people in any kind of way. But when you go to an event like this, or if you run into somebody who has read your work, it can be very inspiring for you to sit down and do more. And if you're an author, even if you are self-publishing or writing things for a class, if you ever have the opportunity to do something like this, I highly recommend it, because it could be the thing that makes you sit and write that novel or screenplay or whatever it is that you're working on. Sometimes just seeing the excitement in a kid's eyes about my book, where they start to ask me questions about maybe some of the world building stuff I've done, and I thought nobody would ever ask me this question, and here they are with it. That can be the thing that really makes me light a fire and go home and write more.
Can I just add to your point about it being very solitary writing? One of the most important things I found as a writer, long before I even published a book, was building my writing community with, friends who wrote, friends who enjoyed reading. We'd critique each other's work, and even beyond that, we'd motivate each other to write. We'd support each other on our wins. We'd support each other with all the rejections, because there could be a lot of those too. And having those people in your life kind of helps it feel like it's not alone, because a lot of times you are, in by yourself writing. And so, I always say one of my best writing pieces of advice is building out that community.
Yeah, I agree. The same thought. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say.
I
second what you
disagree.
said, yes.
They often say, writing is a lonely profession, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You have critique groups, you have writers groups, you have people that you can talk to. You go to writers' conferences, you meet people, and it's through these people you learn things. You learn, maybe they've tried something that didn't work. You don't have to go down that road and make that mistake. And it's a big thing, which is the biggest detail with me. I think the biggest challenge with me for writing fantasy and pretty much science fiction too, because I do that very heavily, was the details. Okay, and just I never quite get over the fact that the smallest of details can ruin the best of intentions. I remember I had a fantasy novel that was taking place in this guild hall, on the second floor of a guild hall, and I had a demon who had hoop and claws, and he had, the stench breath of dead flesh, and he smelled like sulfur, and he was schizophrenic, and he argued with himself, and he had issues. And I brought him in. I had him clip-clopping down the stone floor so everybody would know he was coming. It was a big, grandiose entrance. And then it was pointed out to me in a critique group a short time later that if it was a stone floor, it could not be on the second floor. It had to be on the first floor, and for some reason, I forget what it was, I couldn't have it on the first floor, so I was so bummed out about that. But you really have to, the thing is, when you're dealing with those details, it can hit you when you least expect it. And sometimes after you've really written something that you're really proud of, you're really psyched about, you really love, that's a challenge.
For me, the biggest challenge, and probably in life in general, is my inner critic that is probably more harsh than anyone that criticizes me often could be, particularly when it comes to my writing, because I'll just be like, man, this is just not working, it's not good enough. And then I think I've had the revelation with different projects, but with the Paperboy specifically, there was a time where I let it sit aside for a while. I was looking for a publisher, it wasn't happening, and I just was really frustrated with what to do with it. And then I came back to it and I read it, and it felt like I didn't write it in a good way, where I wasn't being critical of it in the same way. And that was very sort of like eye-opening. Like, okay, sometimes that I've found it to fight the criticism I have for myself is give myself a little space from the project, because I assume it's the same with that, but I pour a lot of myself into my writing and my creating. That's what I do as a person. Like, life in a way is art, and I try to express myself creatively in a lot of ways. Like, I cut up comic books to make collages. That's one thing I do. Just I write, obviously. Those things help me tap into that, to just be creative and express things. But like, when I look at these things, sometimes like I'm too negative and towards myself, and I don't. That's my biggest personal issue, and speaking more broadly in life, but certainly in my writing. There's a lyric by singer-songwriter Josh Ritter. It says, in the song "Snow Is Gone," which was the first song my wife and I, when we got married, to play right after we got married. So it says, "I'm singing for the love that have mercy on a man that sings to be adored." And I just remind myself of that. Okay, whenever I'm critical of myself and the writings, like, I'm doing this because it's the passion to do it. And then what everyone else said, like the community, that stuff is what then builds it up. Like when I was in school, and now I was just connected with other writers, and even just now here on this panel, like we kind of connected, and like we started with little jokes, and we don't know each other.
For life.
Yeah, other than via email, we don't know each other prior to this, and there's just something that helps. And you all being here, no joke, in my head, it was going to be my wife and kids and our two friends in the front row. Unfortunately, there's more people, and that's amazing. But I'm like, no one's going to show up because I'm on the panel. Like that's, I'm Eeyore over here. And so that's my biggest problem. I think personally, I don't know if that's just a me thing, but I need to like overcome that. And I think that then the community really does help me have that resilience and be able to do that. Like, it's like, just keep working. Maybe it is bad, that's okay too. The next thing can be good, you can work on it and make it better. So.
I'm constantly afraid I'm going to be the only person at my events. I also just want to add one more thing, if that's all right. To Neil's point about like going to conferences and stuff, like learning and absorbing like a sponge is fantastic. And one thing I would say is don't negate the value of volunteering. I know, especially when I started out writing, I was in a really tough financial situation, so I couldn't afford conferences. This is fantastic that this is a free event, which is great. And so I try to go to free events. I would also volunteer at conferences because I couldn't afford to go on my own, so I would volunteer. I'd spend half the time, working for them, and then the other half the time, going to different panels. If you volunteer, you're also likely to see a lot more behind the scenes, and so you're probably meeting more of the writers or editors or publishers as well, because you're, helping people out or, restocking the green room. There are ways to, make it work. I actually, in addition to having a day job, I babysat for like probably about a year and a half, saving up to hire my first editor. And because these things are tough, and I get that a lot of writing conferences can be, expensive, as valuable as they can be. And so, volunteering is a great way to not just save money, which is great, but also meet people, both, more, the successful people, but also other people who are, maybe starting out or, interested or in different levels, which is a great way to, again, build your community.
Another great resource is, if you're interested in writing for, children all the way up to YA, is the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. They can be extremely helpful. They usually have a branch in almost every city, and they'll have meetings sometimes like once a month or more frequently, and they hold all kinds of events that have editors and critique groups, and it's just a great place to connect with other people doing the same thing as you. A lot of my writer friends I met through that way.
And they all had to deal with the vegetable revolt.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have about 9 minutes to take any audience questions. If anyone would like to raise their hand. Yes, go ahead.
So I would like to ask
Okay, so the question was, is there a story that inspired us that we hated, and that was what influenced us to write something?
Little did you know the second row is actually for friends and family. My mom's right there. Hi, Mom. And she can attest that in the 3rd grade, she had to write a note to my teacher because he would read to us very scary stories to tell in the dark. And I had a wonderfully vivid, creative imagination that would help me so much later in life. But in 3rd grade, it gave me so many nightmares listening to those stories that my parents were like, we're not getting any sleep. We need our daughter not to be in this story time. So I think I was given like a hall pass to go and not listen to those stories. And for me, feeling such a visceral sense of fear, because I'd hear those stories and then I'd be home at night and be like, what if the hands come out from under my bed? And, it's sort of just this really macabre, frightening world, stuck with me. And actually the manuscript that I'm editing right now was very much of what if, the premise is there's a girl raised in a city full of undead, and she doesn't have superpowers, she doesn't have magic, she's human, and trying to deal with oh my god, there's all of these supernatural undead monsters that if I screw up will kill me in many ways. So I think just that visceral feeling of I gotta be on my A game because I am at an immediate disadvantage has clearly stuck with me.
For me, I think I don't really have anything I could point to say oh, this really set me off in a way. But for my series, Doomsday Camp, I was really influenced a lot by the movie Mad Max. I kept thinking what are all the kids doing while their parents are off doing car races and stealing gasoline? Where are they?
Did they have little kids on bumper cars?
I mean, sometimes they did, but they were teenagers. So I was thinking about what else is going on in this world? But I do think it's sometimes interesting if there's a book or a movie or something where you think about the part that they didn't include, and that was always what really would get me if I didn't like a story.
For me, it's not really stories that I hate, it's life events or people who have made me mad that really inspires them. Any other questions?
I do want to show you my nails since you worked with them.
Cute! Super cute.
Nail became my COVID art hobby because I would spend all day at work on the computer and all night writing. And so my eyeballs were melting out of my face. And so I'm I need something that's not on the computer to give my eyes a rest. So I decided to get into really, really tiny art.
Okay, yes. When did we start our writing career? What age, specifically?
I dabbled in writing most of my life, but very dabbly. I always enjoyed storytelling, but for a lot of my younger life, the way I told stories was as an actor on stage. So I actually didn't get very serious into writing probably until my 20s, late 20s. I was in my 30s when my first book came out. And for me, part of me was oh no, I'm too old. I'm not debuting at 19 like I should be. But what I realized is there really is no should. I think anytime you want to tell a story, so long as you're not dead, or perhaps undead, in which case it doesn't matter, any age, that really there's no wrong age to start writing.
For me, I can tell you it was when I was in 2nd grade. I loved show and tell. I loved going into the class and telling stories about these, funny things that had happened around my house. And I would just get the kids howling about things that had happened. And I remember I had a teacher and she had said to me you're a really good artist and you like to draw. She gave me a blank book and she asked me to draw one of the stories that I had told in show and tell. And that was the first time I had ever even thought to do something like that. And to this day, I can still remember what the story was, and it had stuck with me even as an adult. When my first adult book came out, which would have been about 2009, I still think about that teacher and how that impacted me.
For me, it was in the 5th grade, a little bit older, but I remember specifically we had an assignment where we had to write about our family vacation. And we weren't like poor, but we couldn't afford a vacation. I'm one of 4 boys. We grew up in the woods in Pennsylvania. Like we had a house, but we were in the woods. And so we didn't have any good vacation. So I was kind of, I don't know that I was embarrassed, but I didn't have anything to say. So I just made up a completely fictional story, which was not the parameters of the assignment. It was to write about a real vacation. So I made everything up. It was about this island you can go to and have all these adventures. It was, full of all the things I loved at the time, comic books, all that kind of stuff, which is still in the novel, I still love it. So that was the vote. But then what happened was there was a vote for the other students that their 2 favorites. And one was this kid who went to like Cabo, right? And then mine. So it was like these 2 very different contrasting things. Like the vacation everybody really wanted to go on, and then like the vacation that like everybody dreamed they could go on because it doesn't exist in mine. That was when I knew I wanted to be a writer, when I was in the 5th grade. And I'm like, I kind of like that thing when you receive that feedback in some way that affirms that, oh, you can tell stories. So that was...
Yeah, I think storytelling is what it comes down to. I loved telling stories from an early age. I really didn't get serious about writing until college, and even then it was limited mostly to magazines and that kind of thing. But as far as like the novel and everything else, that started way later in life for me. It actually started in 2008. I can get the exact year on that one for you because there were some things that happened in my personal life, and I finally decided, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to move forward with. I've always been dancing around it my whole life. One of the greatest aspects of being a writer is procrastination, and I've got that down really good, so.
Okay, well, we are at time, so I just wanted to give the authors a chance to share where we can find them online or on social media. So.
BrandiJune.com, Brandie. She wanted to make sure no one would spell my name right. And also at the booth here till 4. So, yes, thank you.
You can find me at joshuahauke.com, and I'm also upstairs, so hopefully some of you guys will stop by and chat some more.
So you can find me YouTube, Instagram, Josiah is Right, W-R-I-T-E, as in writer, so that's how you can find me, and upstairs, over there in the circle area. So.
NeilVYoung.com, and I am also up here until 4 o'clock.
And you can find me at the library. I'm here almost every day.